doing this. The talk title today is The Ethics of Resistance, from Thoreau to Bonhoeffer to you. And we're going to be listening to Cordell Schulten. Cordell Schulten is an adjunct professor at Missouri Baptist University and serves as a pastor for the English Ministry Congregation at the Korean Presbyterian Church in Kirkwood, Missouri. Previously, he was an associate professor of American law at Hangdong Global University in Pohang, Korea. Pohang, Korea. He also taught at Bonn University. Before teaching, he practiced law for 10 years, specializing in commercial litigation and death penalty cases. Cordell earned his MA in Theological Studies from Covenant Theological Seminary in 2004 and his JD from St. Louis University School of Law in 1986. He has also done graduate studies in theological and culture at Concordia Seminary in St. Louis. Cordell and his wife Sandy have been married for 38 years. They have 4 children, 5 grandchildren. Cordell serves at the Korean Presbyterian Church of St. Louis, PCA.
Thank you. Thank you, JJ. Yeah. Well, I'm very happy to be with you this morning. I was here last summer. That was my first base camp experience. So some of you may have had the opportunity to be a part of that presentation. You'll notice some consistency. Last summer I spoke about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and this summer I'm going to conclude this presentation with a connection into Bonhoeffer's life and ideas. But before I get started, I just want to get to know you a little bit better. First question I have, though, is have any of you in your high school experience, or some of you may already be into your college experience, have any of you ever engaged in any sort of protest or response and all? Oh, interesting. Let's start here and we'll come around. Yes. And your name is? Lauren. Yes, Lauren.
I've gone to the Women's March, a pro-immigration rally, and march about the election in November.
Wow. The Women's March in D.C.? In St. Louis. Okay, wonderful, wonderful. And then the immigration issue, when was that?
That was, I want to say February.
Okay, just recently too, also.
It was in the Muslim ban that was happening.
Right, interesting. Very good, very good. And so there with many other people, was the immigration issue, was that the gathering in Clayton, Missouri, near Senator Blunt's office?
It was the one at the airport.
Oh, up at the airport. Okay, very good, very good. Yes, sir, and your name is? David, yes.
So I went to the March for Life in Washington, D.C.
Excellent.
That was crazy. It was like 500,000 people.
Right.
Yeah. And so, which is funny on how the other march got more media attention.
I understand. Yeah. Well, you're never in control of what other people do, only what you do, right?
And the other one that I went to, okay, like I actually am pro-Trump, but I went to an anti-Trump rally whenever I was down there just to look at things.
Okay.
People were up to down there.
Uh-huh.
Talk to some people, get to hear what they have to say.
Interesting. Very good. Very good. I saw one other hand toward the back. Did someone else indicate? Huh? Yes, sir.
My church has done stuff related to the situation in Ferguson.
Oh, very good. Right. Excellent. So in terms of being out and present in the community, or?
We went down to Ferguson a couple times, we prayed, and then we did a walk.
Did a walk? Yeah. Excellent. Very good. I believe that as you continue along your path, whether you're headed off to college or university, or whether you are already engaged in a job, whether you are in a local church or part of a community organization, I believe that in this day and age, you're going to have more and more opportunities to be confronted with a question of, what is my responsibility? How am I to engage the issues, the debates, the policy considerations that are going on in our society today? Especially with on the campus, there's going to be a lot of active discussions and considerations and debates even. I don't know, I just recently learned about the Oxford Union. I don't know if anyone's ever, they have a YouTube channel, and they have these vigorous debates at Oxford, and it's really a fascinating, I subscribe to it, and so now I get notifications almost every other day of a new posting of debating all of the hot topics of our day. So the question becomes, how do I responsibly engage? What is my responsibility? So now, I asked, the first question was, I asked, how many of you have been involved in some form of demonstration or protest? Now I have another, a little bit more refined question. Has anybody ever been involved in civil disobedience? In civil disobedience? That's exactly where I'm going, David. Very good question. David asked me, can I define that? And that's what that's the reason I'm asking the question. I want to know, have you heard that phrase before? Is that something on your radar screen? And what does that mean to you when you hear the phrase civil disobedience? Anyone want to venture? Just from your studies, reading, discussions, experience. And your name is, again, Caleb. How can I forget? How can I forget Caleb? My oldest son is Caleb also. So I told him that earlier. Yes, Caleb.
Well, one major thing that comes up when it comes to civil disobedience is Mohammed Gandhi.
Okay.
Certainly because of the British oppression against the country of India.
Okay. And when you think of Gandhi, and we're going to talk a little bit more, and we're going to actually look at some of his words and his actions and his life. When you think of Gandhi, how does that express to you? How does that relate to you, the notion of civil disobedience? Civil disobedience, what are some other words that you might use if you're trying to get a handle on the notion of civil disobedience? Like, why do they call it civil, and why do they call it disobedience? Caleb.
Peaceful protest.
Okay, peaceful protesting. Peaceful protesting, so the civil, the notion of peaceful, disobedience, the protesting. But what are some of the forms? What are some of the forms? Yes.
It's like breaking an unjust law.
Ah.
A letter from a Birmingham jail.
Very good. And I'm sorry, you are? Nancy. Yes, Nancy. All right. Choosing to violate a law that has been deemed by you and by others to be unjust. You violate the law in order to demonstrate the injustice of that law. JJ.
It usually comes in some kind of unique form, so not just simply like stealing something when it's wrong to steal something, but through literature or writings or something like that.
Right, exactly. So, yeah, exactly. There's very considered, thoughtful, prepared action that violates an unjust law in order to demonstrate its injustice. And then there's one other dimension of civil disobedience that's very, very important. And we're going to actually look at the roots of the ideas of civil disobedience that they don't actually start, but the person in American history that first articulated them was Henry David Thoreau. And then it moves across the world and into the life and words and actions of Mohandas Gandhi. And then we're going to come back to Dr. King, and we're going to look specifically at Letter from a Birmingham Jail. That was referred to Monday afternoon in the presentation. And I always tell my students at university, if you're an American student and you have not thoughtfully read, reflected, and debated and discussed the ideas of Dr. King in his Letter from a Birmingham Jail, you should not consider yourself educated. That is one of the core expressions of American engagement, responsible living in our history. And we're going to look at some of the notable passages from Letter from Birmingham Jail in just a minute. But what are some of the specific, JJ was saying, it's not just anything, but it's a very deliberate, considered, prepared action to violate an unjust law. So can anybody give me an example from just your general knowledge, background discussion? What would be an example of civil disobedience? And then I'm asking for this one other element that oftentimes is forgotten, but it is the core of civil disobedience.
Maybe people who thought they were.
Could be.
Okay.
Yeah.
Example in today's world is Antifa. They think that capitalism is evil and promotes like the worst things of the world, and they think that the United States needs to be brought down. So in turn, they do stuff like riot and everything. They disobey the laws of the government since they're anarchists.
Okay, now that's an extreme, exactly, David. That's a very extreme form. That is beyond civil. That is a fomenting of disorder, of chaos, of, as you say, you describe them as anarchists. They are opposed to any sort of human structures of government. You will notice in our discussion today that all of these notable thinkers and activists all recognized that government, forms of government, are a part of human society. And so Thoreau, Gandhi, King, and then ultimately Dietrich Bonhoeffer never said that there should not be government. So yeah, we've gone to an extreme. And JJ, and then Nancy, and then Lauren. JJ.
Would that missing element you're talking about being that their purpose in civil disobedience is to, in fact, like refine and help the government and weed out the incorrect practices of it?
Right, and that, how is that done to bring about that change? They want change, and they want change for the betterment of all, but what is the action that they're willing to experience in order to raise that level of awareness to demonstrate the injustice? Lauren?
They're willing to like put themselves in possible danger or like public scrutiny for the better of the people, because the more attention it gets, like the more it's likely to change. And so an example of that would be like Rosa Parks.
Exactly. Okay, good example, Lauren. Rosa Parks, what was unjust? It was unjust that the African American people had to sit in the back of the bus. That was unjust. Everybody needed transportation. It's a human necessity. Needed the transportation to get to work. Everyone is a human being, and there ought not to be a segregation of services based upon who I am as a human being. So she violated that policy. She violated it. Was in the form of a law, but she was willing to suffer the consequences of violating, because she knew that just the act of violating, of disobeying, was not going to bring about change. Rather, the change had to come from a growing awareness that would permeate through society, that then through the appropriate means that David was talking about before, the appropriate means of government and our governmental society and our governmental processes, we would go through appropriate changes to eliminate that injustice. So she's willing to put herself at risk. And ultimately, Nancy, you had a point too.
Well, I was thinking another missing element could that possibly be the sanctity of conscience. You know, perhaps there's a higher moral authority, like when Huck Finn tears up the letter.
Yeah.
I don't care if I go to hell.
That's right.
It's right to free Jim.
Exactly. So, yes, when we said an unjust law, we have to say, how do you know? How do you know it's an unjust law? What is your standard for determining whether a human law, a law of human government is just or unjust? You have to have a standard. You have to find a standard in your life that will guide you, that you will submit yourself to, that is a matter of conscience, individual conscience, just as Nancy has pointed out. Okay, so let's start our tour. Excellent. You guys are you're on your way. You're on your way to grappling with this most important question. And the most important question to me is, and I am a follower of Christ. By God's grace, was brought to faith in Christ when I was in high school. And my question for myself is, how do I live a responsible life as a follower of Christ here, now, within the realities of where I find myself, within the realities of who I meet day by day? We don't deal with people in categories and groups, but rather I engage others as I meet them, one by one, person by person. So let's begin our little survey of the history of civil disobedience and resistance. We'll go back to this fellow, Henry David Thoreau. We didn't know he was such a good-looking guy, right? Right, he's a good-looking guy. Huh? Don't you think? All right, no. Okay. So what do you know about Thoreau? Tell me what you know about Thoreau. Yes, Nancy.
Walden Pond.
Ah.
His motto was simplify, simplify,
Simplify. Exactly.
Life is frittered away by details.
Yes. Does anybody still watch Dead Poets Society? Yeah? Okay. What's the big Thoreau quote in Dead Poets Society? Do you recall? Most men or women live lives of quiet desperation. And Mr. Keating says to his students, don't let that be true of you. Find a purpose. Live your life to the fullest. So, Henry David Thoreau, did you know? So he goes off to Walden Pond. He lives in a cabin by a pond called Walden. Simplify. My oldest son, Caleb's namesake, my Caleb lives in southern Oregon, in the woods, in a cabin, by a pond. I call it Walden 3. And so I have somewhat of a personal engagement. But did you know that Henry David Thoreau was also, some who have taken American Lit, do you remember what group of writers Thoreau is a part of? Starts with a T. Excellent, David. Transcendentalists, and that included Emerson, Ralph Waldo Emerson, which was sort of Thoreau's older good friend, and others. So one of the things that Thoreau was engaging in his effort to live a responsible life is, how do I react to my American government's policies with respect to slavery? And also with respect at the time that he was living in the early 1800s, I should say, some of the other wars that were taking place before the Civil War, wars with other groups around the United States. And Thoreau wrote an essay, one of the most famous essays, entitled On Civil Disobedience. And in that essay, Thoreau wrote this: I heartily accept the motto that the government is best which governs least. And I should like to see it acted up to more rapidly and systematically. Carried out, it finally amounts to this, which I also believe, that government is best which governs not at all. And when men are prepared for it, that will be the kind of government which we will have. Now, today, we would say that's an articulation of, in a political theory, of a libertarian position, that government is to be the least, simply very limited functions of government, but definitely not in the arena of social policy or things of that nature. Well, one of the biggest issues of Thoreau's era was slavery. And Thoreau had a personal conviction that the system of slavery as it existed in America in the 19th century was wrong, was morally wrong. It was that it was unjust. And so he went on to say this. But he recognized that slavery was a part of the law of the United States. This was pre-Civil War. He's writing this in the 1820s, early 1830s. He goes on to say this: unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them? Option 1. I'm a citizen. I have a responsibility to obey my government. Even if it's an unjust law, I just go ahead and obey it. Number 2, or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we have succeeded? Option 2, work for change. Work for change within the existing systems that are available to you, but continue to obey the unjust law and just work for change. Or notice option number 3, shall we transgress them at once? Men generally under such a government as this think that they ought to wait until they have persuaded the majority to alter them. They think that if they should resist, the remedy would be worse than the evil. But it is the fault of the government itself that the remedy is worse than the evil. It makes it worse. Why is it not more apt to anticipate and provide for reform? Why does it not cherish its wise minority? Why does it not encourage its citizen to put out its faults and do better than it would have them? So Thoreau is perplexed. How do I react? What do I do? How do I act responsibly in the face of an unjust law? Thoreau's conclusion was not to pay his taxes. He chose not to pay his taxes. He chose not to contribute to a system that was propagating the unjust system of slavery. So he writes in his essay, if 1,000 men were not to pay their tax bills this year, that would not be a violent and bloody measure as it would be to pay them. And what he means by that is, as I am contributing this tax, these tax revenues are being used to propagate slavery. They're being used to prosecute the wars that he believed also were unjust. So he chose not to pay his tax, as it would be to pay them, and enable a state to commit violence and shed innocent blood. This is, in fact, the definition of a peaceable revolution, if any such is possible. So Thoreau's method, Thoreau's specific choice of responsible action, in his case, was not to pay his taxes. But you know what happened when you don't pay your taxes? You know what happens when you don't pay your taxes? You get prosecuted. You are violating the law. And you get put in prison. And he did. He was jailed. He accepted that, and that is the element of civil disobedience that is so crucial, because you see, civil disobedience is not, as David was warning us before, anarchy. True civil disobedience is a submission to authority. It's both submission and resistance. So I submit to authority. I willingly, as Lauren pointed out before, expose myself to the risk of losing my own freedom, my own liberty, my own well-being, maybe my health, possibly my life. But I'm doing it choosing responsible action to act against an unjust law in order to bring to the attention of others the injustice and the need for change and reform. But it is, I believe, one of the most Christian responses, because it is taking up the burden of another and willingly. It is taking up your cross. What's your cross? Your cross is a place where you die. And it is where you die for others. For others. This is responsible action within the concrete realities of life. So now, Caleb already alerted us to Mohandas Gandhi. What do you know about Gandhi? Oh, this is when he was young, and this is when he was old. Was he a good-looking guy? No, okay. I don't know. What did we just say? Even when he was young, I think he was a pretty handsome dude when he was young and all. You know, I know all of us sort of lose it when we get older. So what do you know? What do you know about Gandhi? Tell me what you know about Gandhi. Anybody? Gandhi. What's the difference? Mohandas was his given name. You know what Mahatma? Mahatma was the name that everyone attributed to him. It was the honorific. Do you know what Mahatma means? Anybody? The great souled one. The great souled one. Gandhi. What else? What do you know about Gandhi? Just thumbnail sketches. Yes.
He was known for his general, he was very interested in keeping the peace. He disagreed.
Right. Very good, very good. And your name is? Tasha. Okay, thank you, Tasha. Very much devoted to this. Remember Thoreau said, peaceable revolution, if such is possible? Does anyone know how Gandhi chose to disobey? What was the first unjust law of the British Empire ruling India back in the, this was in the early 1900s, okay? This is like 1920s, 1930-ish. You remember, does anyone know what the first law that Gandhi chose to violate was? The British government had imposed a tax. Ooh, does that sound familiar? Had imposed a tax on a commodity. Do you know what the commodity was? Salt. Exactly. The British government imposed a tax on salt. By the way, did you have salt on your breakfast? Any part of your breakfast this morning? Like maybe your eggs? Possibly. It was probably, salt was probably in any, if you had processed food this morning, you had salt. Oh, by the way, how much salt makes up your body? Who's the biologist? Who's the pre-med person in here? A lot. There's a lot of salt. Okay? Salt is essential. It's a human necessity. And so Gandhi was very thoughtful. Gandhi was very deliberate. He was very reflective, and he chose to first target the unjust tax on salt because everybody needs salt. Why should anyone be prohibited from having salt just because they couldn't pay the tax? And so now, how did he gain greater awareness for this? His effort against, he had made a decision to violate the unjust salt tax law. He started a march from his community where he lived, called an ashram. He was Hindu and he lived in a communal village. And from his ashram up in the central part on the west side of India, he started a march that took him, as he walked day by day, took him over a month to walk down to a point in the southern tip of India. And as he walked, people gathered together. And oh, by the way, side note, if you really want to see a great documentary on this, there is a documentary entitled A Force More Powerful. A Force More Powerful. You can get it on YouTube now. And it has several episodes of all of the notable acts of civil disobedience within the 20th century. And it has a great 30-minute episode on Gandhi. And they interview people at the time they made the documentary who knew him, who lived with him, who were with him. And it's just an amazing documentary. So, as he was going, he would write. So here's his theory of civil disobedience. Remember, all of these guys, they all recognize government. They all recognize government. And I have to keep track of the time, or someone is my timekeeper. So I need to finish around 10-ish or a little after to give everybody plenty of time to ask more questions, or please interact with other questions along the way too. But that's my target. That's my target. Are you going to do it, David? Appreciate it. Okay, so he's writing, and he recognizes that government is a role of human society. So he says this: there are two ways of establishing such a government: that of the big stick and violence. That's essentially what the British were doing in enforcing their imperial rule, their colonial rule over India at this time, the big stick and violence. And here's the other alternative, that of nonviolence or civil disobedience. We have chosen the second alternative, regarding it as our dharma, that is our way, that's a Hindu expression, our way of living. And it is because of this that we have set out to prepare salt, after serving notice on the government to that effect. I mean, he wasn't doing this in secret. Everybody knew that as they were marching down toward the sea, that they were going to violate the salt law. Everyone knew that, and they joined in. I understand there being a tax on such things as the hookah, beedies, and liquor. Okay, so you can tax luxury items, entertainment items, your smokes and your drinks. Such taxes should now be. But should one levy a tax on salt? An essential. Everybody needs salt. Such taxes should now be repealed. We should make a resolve that we shall prepare salt, eat it, sell it to the people, and while doing so, court imprisonment if necessary. Notice, Willing, JJ, is that a hand?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
So had Gandhi at this point already been directly in contact with the writings of Thoreau and everything like that? Like, did he develop some of these from his
If you, Gandhi's autobiography is entitled My Experiments with Truth. And when you read his own passage as he describes it, do you know where Gandhi was educated from India? You know where he was educated? He went to England for his education. He was educated as, of all things, a lawyer. He actually practiced law. He started his practice in India and didn't do too well, and so he moved over to South Africa, and that's where his law practice sort of took off. And there's some wonderful passages about that, but I won't talk about that right now. But through his education, he had encountered Thoreau, and as he began to reflect more and more on these deliberate acts of civil disobedience, he was engaging the ideas of Thoreau and others too. So it's not just Thoreau, but there were many others that he was thinking about, talking about along the way. But notice, here's the key. He's not an anarchist. He's not intent on overthrowing, but rather bringing about change and willing to go to prison if that is necessary to raise the awareness of others of the injustice. If our people get ready to violate the salt tax, the government does not have enough accommodation in jails to house so many people. That's a direct allusion to Thoreau right there. Remember the quote that we had from Thoreau's essay? That's a direct allusion to it. The salt tax must be repealed now. The fact that a sea of humanity had gathered and showered blessings upon us, that is a good omen. And if we climb even one step, we shall readily be able to climb the other steps leading to the place of independence. Now, he was looking for the independence of his homeland from British colonial rule. You know how long it took him? From this salt march until ultimately the United Kingdom, Great Britain gave India its independence? Over 17 years that he deliberately and faithfully pursued his path of nonviolent civil disobedience. Violating the salt tax was just the beginning of it. Now, Gandhi influenced Dr. King. Okay. Good-looking guy, right? This is his graduate picture right there, all right, from Morehouse College. Sharp-looking dude. Okay, tell me what you know about Dr. King. Anything that has impressed you along the way that has stayed in your memory, Caleb?
Despite all the controversy in the 1960s, he took one of the major leading roles in the civil rights movement.
No, unquestionably was a leader in the civil rights movement. Tasha, you had your hand up, I believe?
That's what I was gonna say.
Okay, very good. David?
One thing that's kind of stuck out about him to me is that there was some violence on his own side, you know, on the side who wanted freedom from the oppression. Yet
Right.
He said, like, hey, you guys need to stop committing violence on your side because you're no better than the other side.
There it is. Excellent point. Excellent point. There was an effort. Many people were saying, this is taking too long. It's taking too long. We have to take more aggressive action. We have to fight back because they were the victims of abuse in many ways, and they willingly accepted it. In fact, when they were arrested for example, the lunch counter sit-ins in Nashville and Greensboro, North Carolina, Nashville, Tennessee, and other places, college students, okay, African American college students and white college students together taking up the cause of saying this is wrong, this is unjust, to have a policy that says when you buy something at a department store, we'll take your money to purchase the products, but you cannot sit down at our lunch counter in this very same store and have a meal. We'll accept your money for your purchase of groceries, but you can't sit at our lunch counter. And so you had students from American Baptist College in Nashville, by the way, and also from Fisk, F-I-S-K, Fisk University in Nashville. Both African American and white and Asian together coming and going to these lunch counters. They were arrested. They were violating basic peace ordinances. They were breaching the peace. They were violated. And when they went up to be arraigned in court, this is Nashville, and in that documentary, A Force More Powerful, you'll see the actual video footage. That's what makes that documentary so cool. The judge said, okay, $50 fine for violating, you violated the ordinance, the local peace ordinance. And they said, Your Honor, I will not pay the fine. If you don't pay the fine, you're going to be a month in jail. Thank you, Your Honor. I'll go to jail. And they willingly went to jail and filled the jails in Nashville. Why? To dramatize the injustice, to demonstrate that this policy, this law was unjust. You might be asking yourself, how did they come to that conclusion? Dr. King talks about that in his letter from a Birmingham jail. This is and it's available on the internet. It's not that long. You can read it in a matter of minutes, but you need to think about it and ponder it and discuss it. So he wrote this letter because there were a group of pastors, both white and African American in Birmingham, that said, you shouldn't be here. You're stirring up trouble coming here to Birmingham. You're an Atlanta boy. Stay over there in Georgia. Don't come here to Alabama. And so he wrote, oh, and by the way, he had no library when he wrote this. He had only his own thoughts and what he had studied and read and reflected upon. So he had no Google. All right? Don't rely upon Google. Get it into your head and into your heart. These types of words. I think I should indicate why I'm here in Birmingham. Since you have been influenced by the view which argues against outsiders coming in. I have the honor of serving as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, an organization operating in every southern state with headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia. Several months ago, the affiliate here in Birmingham asked us to be on call to engage in a nonviolent direct action program if such were deemed necessary. Okay, 2 things so far. He's available to respond to the call of others. And secondly, he has this thought process with what is necessary. What are the necessary actions that must be taken? We readily consented. And when the hour came, we lived up to our promise. So I, along with several members of my staff, am here because I was invited here. But more basically, I am in Birmingham because injustice is here. Just as the prophets of the 8th century BC left their villages and carried their "Thus saith the Lord" far beyond the boundaries of their hometowns. By the way, Amos in the Old Testament, you know Amos, not Andy, but Amos. Yeah, that's an old illusion. Only a few of you laughed at that one. Okay, it was an old radio show. Okay, Amos in the Old Testament, minor prophet. Where's he from? Down south in Judah, around Bethlehem. He's a shepherd. God calls him to go up to the king of Israel in the north. He was open, available, ready, and he went out of his comfort zone to respond to the call of God and to do what was necessary. And just as the Apostle Paul left his village of Tarsus and carried the gospel of Jesus Christ to the far corners of the Greco-Roman world, so I am compelled to carry the gospel of freedom beyond my own hometown. Like Paul, I must constantly respond to the Macedonian call for aid. The Christian life is a life of responsibility. Okay? And responsibility means at its heart, you are ready to respond to others, to the needs of others, to the call of others, to the demands of necessary action. Moreover, I am cognizant, and this is what Professor Bonhoeffer referred to in his talk Monday afternoon. Moreover, I am cognizant of the interrelatedness of all communities and states. I cannot sit idly by in Atlanta and not be concerned about what happens in Birmingham. And this is the most well-known quote from the letter. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. Put that on a t-shirt. Okay? Wear that. Anybody wearing that today? I'm not, I'm sorry. I should have been. I should have been able to, like right now. So that, but I didn't think far enough ahead. Okay, that's it though. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. That's it. We are all related to one another. What happens to another has a consequence on all. You express a great deal of anxiety over our willingness to break laws. This is certainly a legitimate concern, since we so diligently urge people to obey the Supreme Court's decision of 1954 outlawing segregation in the public schools. By the way, Brown versus Board of Education. That's the case he's referring to there. At first glance, it may seem rather paradoxical for us consciously to break laws. One may well ask, how can you advocate breaking some laws and obeying others? I mean, this is what everybody is thinking. These are the questions you must ask. And so he answers it. The answer lies in the fact that there are 2 types of laws, just and unjust. And I would be the first to advocate obeying just laws. One has not only a legal but a moral responsibility to obey just laws. Conversely, one has a moral responsibility to disobey unjust laws. I would agree with St. Augustine that an unjust law is no law at all. Now, what is the difference between the two? How does one determine whether a law is just or unjust? A just law is a man-made code that squares with the moral law or the law of God. Remember I said you have to have a standard? You have to have a means by which to discern whether human laws are just or unjust. This is Dr. King's standard. And unjust law is a code that is out of harmony with the moral law. To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, oh, by the way, he had no Google. He had no library when he was writing this. This was all coming from his own personal study. These words had become a part of him. He just didn't get through good books got through him. Okay? To put it in the terms of St. Thomas Aquinas, an unjust law is a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and natural law. Any law that uplifts human personality is just. Any law that degrades human personality is unjust. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. It gives the segregator a false sense of superiority and the segregated a false sense of inferiority. Of course, there's nothing new about this kind of civil disobedience. It was evidenced sublimely in the refusal of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, book of Daniel, to obey the laws of Nebuchadnezzar on the ground that a higher moral law was at stake. They were told, worship this idol. They had the 10 Commandments that said, have no other gods before me. And they were driven and responsible to that law. It was practiced superbly by the early Christians who were willing to face hungry lions and excruciating pain of chopping blocks rather than submit to certain unjust laws of the Roman Empire. To a degree, academic freedom is a reality today because Socrates practiced civil disobedience. In our own nation, the Boston Tea Party represented a massive act of civil disobedience. We should never forget that everything Adolf Hitler did in Germany was legal. And everything the Hungarian freedom fighters did in Hungary was illegal. It was illegal to aid and comfort a Jew in Hitler's Germany. Even so, I am sure that had I lived in Germany at the time, I would have aided and comforted my Jewish brothers. If today I lived in a communist country where certain principles dear to the Christian faith are suppressed, I would openly advocate disobeying that country's anti-religious laws. So now Dr. King, in his letter from Birmingham jail, alludes back to Germany. And he says, those who opposed and resisted Hitler were archetypal examples of resistance, responsible living that resisted unjust laws. And so that transitions us to Dietrich Bonhoeffer. This is when he was a student. He was a student in both in Germany, and he came over to the United States at Union Theological Seminary in Manhattan. That's a classmate of his, Jean Lassalle, French guy and a German guy in 1930. Nobody heard about that. The French and the Germans hated each other. Okay, this was worse than the Samaritans and the Jews. And yet, there they are together. And this is Eberhard Bethke. That's his TA, his best student and his teaching assistant. This is the guy who's responsible for us having most of the writings of Bonhoeffer. And this is the last picture of Bonhoeffer from Tegel, from Tegel prison. He was executed at the age of 39. Oh, by the way, how old was Dr. King when he was assassinated? 39. Wow. Dr. King was assassinated at 39. Bonhoeffer was executed by the Nazis at 39. What do you know about Dietrich Bonhoeffer? I'm sorry? David, I'm really... He was Lutheran, correct. Yeah, he was a Lutheran pastor. He was a professor at University of Berlin. Yes, sir, in the corner.
He was both a pastor and a spy.
Correct, yeah. During the last 4 years of his life, his brother-in-law, a man by the name of Hans von Donani, who was a part of the military intelligence, And that was where the resistance movement was housed within the Nazi military regime. These were the generals and leaders who knew that Hitler was insane and that he had to be eliminated in one way, shape, form, or another. Oh, and now we're treading on some difficult territory. Hans von Dohnanyi persuaded his brother-in-law, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, to become a operative for German intelligence, and he was a double agent. He was actually working for the resistance movement, communicating with the Allied forces, the British primarily, and other members of the Allied forces, and telling them about their plans to overthrow Hitler, and ultimately they made the decision to assassinate Adolf Hitler. And they made several attempts. The conspiracy movement, if you've watched the film Valkyrie, that is a film that's all about one of the failed attempts to assassinate Adolf Hitler. Bonhoeffer was actually in jail already at the time that Valkyrie took place. So here we have Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who grew up in the Germany where Adolf Hitler came to power. He was a professor and pastor, and in 1933, when Adolf Hitler was first appointed chancellor, leader, national leader in Germany, Bonhoeffer gave a radio talk entitled "The Young People's Changed View of the Concept of Leadership." And in German, Leader is, sprechen Sie Deutsch? Führer, the Führer, okay? Who was Adolf Hitler? The Führer, the leader. Does that sound familiar? The great leader, the dear leader. That's going on in today's society. Kim Jong-un in North Korea. Oh, and you have to say it this way, I lived in Korea for 5 years. Kim Jong-un, he, nothing to laugh about. Otto Warmbier is dead. Okay, a college student, not many years older than most of you, simply because he tried to take a poster off the wall in his hotel room in North Korea. So, the whole notion of injustice and unjust leaders that was growing in Germany in the early 1930s is present today. So early on, Bonhoeffer was one of the first of the leaders of the church and the youth, basically youth leaders. He was only 26 when he gave that talk, 27. When the leader requires absolute loyalty to himself, the leader becomes the misleader. Those were his words. That radio broadcast was cut off. They shut the power down on him. Bonhoeffer continued to be involved in, first and foremost, the resistance of the efforts of the Nazi government to take over the church, because the Lutheran Church, as David pointed out before, the Lutheran Church was an established church. It was a church that was funded by the German government. That they had in Europe, they have many established churches. And the Nazi government was trying to take over the Lutheran Church and to prohibit anyone who had even a drop of Jewish blood from being even a member of the church first. And then also, they backed off of that and they wanted to prohibit them from being involved in any sort of ministry. Bonhoeffer opposed that vigorously. It was called the Jewish question. Yes?
Can you restate that quote, the quote that you just said? Can you say it again about when the leader requires absolute authority? I didn't catch all of it.
Yeah. When the leader demands absolute loyalty, then the leader becomes the misleader. You see, because no human even in any governmental position on this earth, is entitled to your absolute loyalty. Your absolute loyalty as a follower of Christ is always owed to Jesus, to a standard above this world, beyond this world. Paul says we are citizens of heaven. That's our ultimate citizenship. So fast forward, let me get you to his writings. Late 1930s, he was reflecting on what was going on and now how there was this growing opposition, and more people were becoming aware of the fact that Hitler and the Nazis had this systematic plan to not only export the Jews, but to exterminate them. And it wasn't generally known, but Hans von Donani and others inside the government had more evidence. And so Bonhoeffer wrote this: "We have been silent witnesses of evil deeds. We have been drenched by many storms. We have learnt the arts of equivocation and pretense. Experience has made us suspicious of others and kept us from being truthful and open. Intolerable acts have worn us down and even made us cynical. Are we still of any use? What we shall need is not geniuses or cynics or misanthropes or clever tacticians, but plain, honest, and straightforward men. Will our inward power of resistance be strong enough and our honesty with ourselves remorseless enough for us to find our way back to simplicity and straightforwardness?" He wrote this when he was already imprisoned for being involved in efforts to enable Jews to escape out of Germany when the law prohibited Jewish migration out of Germany. He was a part of helping many Jews escape. And he got put in prison. That was the first charge that was brought against him. And then later, while he was in prison, they did more investigation, and they found that he was intimately involved in the resistance movement and in the conspiracy plots to even assassinate Hitler. So you might ask, wait a minute, hold on, we've moved to a different channel. Did you notice? Thoreau, Gandhi, Dr. King, as David pointed out to us, when there were those within even Dr. King's movement that wanted to use violence, Dr. King said, no, we must maintain nonviolent civil disobedience. So why do I put Bonhoeffer in here? Bonhoeffer crossed the line. He didn't personally engage in violent acts, but he was there supporting them, encouraging them. In fact, on one occasion, when one of the German military officers who would go in to a meeting with Adolf Hitler, not von Stauffenberg, but an earlier one, with explosives in his pockets, he was going to be a suicide bomber to kill Adolf Hitler. Von Donani brought that young man together with Bonhoeffer, and the young man asked Bonhoeffer, "Would you bless me? Will God forgive me?" And Bonhoeffer said, "I don't know. I don't know if God will forgive you." Bonhoeffer never justified the violations of God's law that were undertaken because they believed it was necessary in order to stop the evil of Hitler. But what he did say to that young man was, "But I do know that we have a merciful and gracious God. And Jesus himself has said, greater love has no man than this, that he lay down his life for his friends." And with that, the young man proceeded on. Now, that attempt failed, as all of the attempts failed to assassinate Adolf Hitler. But then we ask, so what is he doing? Is he justifying this act of violence? David? Okay, almost done. I got 2 more slides. Very good. And then we'll be open up for more question and answers. Because we go to 10:30, right? Yeah, well, we'll be done right before 10:30. But 2 more slides. It was one thing to give an account. This is a biographer. Oh, by the way, it's this guy. This is the most recent biography of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. You may have known of Eric Metaxas's popular biography. That's good. But this was originally published in German and now in English, and it has access to some of the most recently discovered correspondence. And so I would highly recommend, if you want to come down and look at this, this guy is Ferdinand Schlingenseipen. You know. Don't ask me how to spell it. You can see it here in just a minute. Yeah, it's just simply called Dietrich Bonhoeffer, 1906 to 1945, died at 39. Martyr, thinker, man of resistance. Okay, so I'll leave that. You can look at it in just a minute. But this is from this book. It was one thing to give an account of his actions in the conspiracy. It was another thing to try to justify his actions. As Bethke, remember his TA, his best student, explains, for Bonhoeffer, the responsible attitude was not to take his justification before, during, or after what he did into his own hands. He didn't try to justify himself. He couldn't. Only God could ultimately judge his actions. In the extraordinary situation Bonhoeffer found himself in, he felt compelled to act as he did, but only with a profound sense of ethical humility. In Bonhoeffer's view, ethical humility is built into the structure of the responsible life. Responsible persons are free to live and make decisions, but that freedom is always conditioned by our obligation to God and to our neighbor. Our obligation to God and neighbor is fulfilled by responsible action. That is, action on behalf of or in the place of others. Thus, we never engage in responsible action or make ethical decisions in isolation. The community of God is built upon the actions of responsible persons on behalf of or in the place of others. Here's the important point to conclude from that. Bonhoeffer realized, as a good Lutheran, that Lutherans teach you can lose your salvation, by the way. I grew up a Lutheran. You can act in such a way as to ultimately take yourself out of God's grace. That is possible, according to Lutheran doctrine. Bonhoeffer realized that what he was doing was putting at risk his eternal salvation. But he was convinced that it was necessary for him to do it in order to live responsibly for others. That's the depth of his commitment to responsible living. And so he writes, this is the last one, who stands fast? Only the man or woman whose final standard is not his or her reason, principles, conscience, freedom, or virtue, but who is ready to sacrifice all this when he or she is called to obedient and responsible action in faith and in exclusive allegiance to God. The responsible man who tries to make his whole life an answer to the question and call of God. Where are these responsible people? And I trust that as you think about these ideas, think about these people that we've talked about, and there are many, many more. I'd recommend again that book and documentary, A Force More Powerful. There are exemplary women, and next time I give this lecture, I will add in, I should have added in today, examples of exemplary women who lived responsible lives. And I trust that when the question is posed, where are these responsible people? You will respond as Isaiah did, here am I, send me. Thank you very much. So, yes, ma'am.
So you mentioned just like a minute ago that Bonhoeffer was willing to put his own eternal salvation at risk as per his beliefs.
Correct.
For the sake of living what he felt to be a responsible life. Do you think that that's really the best action for a Christian to take? Because wouldn't a responsible life be following what God would want you to do? So why would that have to put your eternal salvation at risk?
Right, and that's an excellent question. By the way, your name is? Ness? Wow, like Locke? Wow. I was just introduced to a new Scottish TV show on Acorn TV called Loch Ness. And I'm sorry, probably other people do that and you get really irritated. I apologize. So Ness has asked a very, very important question. Because I offered that explanation to demonstrate to you the seriousness and commitment of Bonhoeffer's choices. Many believers conclude from their study of the Scriptures, and there are great doctrinal traditions that demonstrate to us that once we come into faith with Christ, we are His. And there is nothing we could ever do that would remove us from that. So if that is your doctrinal foundation, that is to me, honestly, Ness, that's an even stronger motivation to responsible living. Because responsible living is making myself available to the call of God to serve the necessary causes that I see as I encounter people along the way. And by the way, I'm not necessarily advocating searching around for a cause. What I would suggest to you is just know who you are, where you come from, where you are now, the people that you meet, and you will encounter every day people with needs. And you will be called upon in little ways. Those who are faithful in little will be entrusted greater things. To live today. You can live today a responsible life as you are alert to the needs of those that you encounter and you respond to those. Yes, ma'am.
Has it been also tie in with
Sure. And I'm sorry, your name is?
My name's Ivana.
Yvonne. Okay, very good. Yvonne.
Yes.
Okay.
Well, I would like be confused with that stuff too.
Mm.
When so say like it sounds like this is a good thing to do, but with the circumstance or with the consequences of that, is that really what God wants me to do?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm just gonna throw out here that well, my dad taught me. He taught me like this pyramid basically, and there's 3 sections. And the top section was the law of God.
Mm-hmm.
The second section was the law of nature, and the third section were the forever changing laws of men.
Okay.
He was saying that you should always follow that order
Mm-hmm.
to have your priorities and straight.
Right.
And so I was wondering, like, do you think that that's a good idea and do you like that?
I think that's a basic, good structure, but here's my suggestion. When you, and I would encourage you to read and engage Bonhoeffer's ideas more thoroughly as you progress along your way. Start with what I talked about last summer. Does anybody remember the book I talked about last summer? Oh, that's okay, that's okay. Life Together, very good, all right. Start with Life Together, excellent. Little book, short book. And then progress to Cost of Discipleship. And then, yeah, you guys did the study. You did the follow-up study a couple of years ago. I was there 2 summers ago with my student who's back. She's doing an internship with Hush Blackwell in Clayton now. Finished her 2nd year, top of her class at Emory Law School. She's back. Those of you who met Damia 2 summers ago. So, engage his ideas on ethics. Oh, and that's the other book that I brought here. Little heavy. Okay. This is actually was published as a result of Eberhard Bethke, his best student and TA. Collected the notes. He was writing this book when he was in prison, and it was ultimately. But this is the Fortress Press edition, and this is the most recent English translation of Bonhoeffer's works. This is 1 volume in the works of Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Oh, by the way, he was executed when he was 39 years old. The works of Dietrich Bonhoeffer fill 16 volumes. Okay? So the question is that a good approach? I think that's a good framework. I agree with your father, that's a good framework, but here's what Bonhoeffer ultimately said. There is no formula. There is no overarching guiding principle. You must every day say, Lord, I need you. I need your Holy Spirit to lead me. I need you to guide me. I need you to show me what is responsible living in the concrete realities of my life today. Now, that's not relativism, because I can hear some of you saying, this sounds like relativism. And, read the book, because he addresses that. Okay? It's not relativism, because Jesus is the truth. He never changes. But I change every day. And my circumstances change every day. Okay, all the way to the back.
Just for the sake of recording, can you repeat the questions?
Oh, thank you. I apologize. I will try to remember that. So, Yvonne's question was, her father gave her a image of a pyramid, and at the top was the law, eternal law of God. And then the next section was the moral law, the laws of nature, okay? What we would call, what Dr. King was referring to there of Thomas Aquinas, the law of nature. And then the bottom base of the pyramid was the ever-changing laws of men. And that you must always prioritize, always ultimately obeying the law of God first, and then discerning down from that standard. Is that fair? And the question was, is that a good framework? And my answer to that is yes, I believe that's a good framework, but with this caveat. Have you heard that word before? Okay. You'll hear that a lot in your college classes a lot. They always like to say caveat, and they always like to say, I need to go on a discursus. It's like, Professor, would you quit cursing us? And I need to go on a discursus. It means a sidetrack, but they just use a Latin word to justify their sidetrack. The caveat is this constant ongoing dependence on the reality of God in you and the promise that God will guide you and direct you. And you may come to a point where you have, and Bonhoeffer basically says this, his ultimate proposition is, the one who acts responsibly will become guilty. Okay, you'll end up violating something along that tier. Okay, David, then Caleb. Oh, did you have your hand up too?
Yeah.
I'm sorry, let's come to you first.
Oh.
Yeah, because David's asked another question.
Obviously this talk is about reacting to the government's unjust laws, but what about government reacting to a criminal or something? So I was wondering what your opinion was on the death penalty.
Very good. You heard my CV? That in my law practice I was appointed on death penalty cases.
Oh yeah.
I didn't choose that. I didn't see, you were listening.
I do remember.
Yeah. I did not choose that area of practice. I went into law hoping to serve Christian families, churches who wanted to do private education, homeschooling. That was my motivation to going into law. But when I got to the firm that I worked for, literally within 2 months, one of the partners came in and put a file that was this thick on my desk and said, you are now a part of the D team. I said, Mr. Short, the D team? Yes, the death team. We had just been appointed to represent Leonard Laws. Google that name. He was considered probably the worst of multiple murderers in St. Louis County back in the 1970s and the 1980s. And I was appointed to represent him on the federal stage of his appeal challenging his death penalty, and which required me to go down and meet with him like this, nothing in between. We were in a little room, a little table, sitting right like this. So that's the context, and your question is, so what's my opinion of the death penalty? I believe that biblically, legally, constitutionally, rightly formed governments, our American government, is entitled in certain circumstances to take the life of a citizen as punishment for a violation of crime. For example, I never took a position that Leonard Laws was not guilty of the murders that he committed. The evidence was overwhelming. The question, though, was it appropriate for him to be punished with the death penalty? And here's the nuance of the argument that you have to get to. You can say, what's due process? Due process in the Fifth Amendment and the 14th Amendment of the United States Constitution says no person, no citizen may be deprived of life, liberty, or property. Okay? Being deprived of property is a criminal fine. Being deprived of liberty is imprisonment. Being deprived of life means capital punishment. It's right there in the Constitution. Justice Scalia and all those who are the original intent interpreters of the Constitution, it's right there. So government is in a position, and I believe Romans chapter 13, you have biblical warrant for governments, human governments, executing justice in criminal cases, in certain criminal cases, and that one of those available penalties is capital punishment. But here's the nuance. In the United States, every state has to have a statutory system of how do we make the decision of when a person is judged guilty of the capital offense, is he to be, or she, because it happens, is to be punished with the ultimate punishment. And our law has a system in place, guided by our constitutional decisions, going all the way back to the late 70s. And our law here in Missouri, I'm most familiar with Missouri because those are the cases I dealt with, say that you have to have a second phase of hearing, same jury, and that jury has to be presented with both evidence in aggravation of the death penalty, and the prosecution has to prove one or more statutory explicit aggravating circumstances, such as the murder was committed in a willfully wanton and heinous manner. That's a statutory aggravating circumstance. Leonard Laws committed one of his murders by driving a butcher knife through the skull of an elderly quadriplegic man. That's willfully wanton and heinous. Okay, so now we've got the aggravating circumstance established. But the law also says that the defense has the obligation to put on evidence in mitigation of the death penalty, and that the jury is to consider both aggravating circumstances and mitigating circumstances. And what did the defense attorney do for Leonard Laws? Nothing. Zero. No investigation. I got the case as one of 3 lawyers assigned to the case. I had 6 months to research this case. I went down and I met with Leonard, and one of the first things I found out was he was a decent enough guy in high school. He babysat his cousins. He was a respectable kid, and he grew up in Mineral Point, Potosi area. Okay? He was a decent kid in high school. Everybody knew him, trusted him. Good kid. Like, I'm sure 50% of the guys in this room, at least. Okay? Decent guys. Okay? Ultimately, but what happened between high school and him turning into this cold-blooded, evil character? Any guesses? What happened to him? He went to Vietnam. And he was a convoy driver, driving a truck in a convoy. His best buddy sitting right beside him. And the convoy was attacked, mortar attack. And he saw his best buddy blown to smithereens. He survived, but his military file, that, by the way, you know where military records are maintained for the entire United States Army? You know where military records are maintained? right here in St. Louis on Page Avenue. Okay? This lawyer, all he had to do was get a subpoena from the court, which is a matter of getting a signature, walk over, drive over, take the bus to Page Avenue and get the guy's military records, and he would have found a plethora of evidence in mitigation of the death penalty. You see, people may be guilty of capital crimes, but the question is, are they to be punished with that ultimate punishment? And that is a case-by-case determination. Yes, the government is entitled to, but they are human beings, and every human being should be given a just hearing. So we made that argument to the United States District Court of Appeals, to Judge William Hungate. Some of you may still remember Judge Hungate. He was the guy who propagated the desegregation case in St. Louis back in the 70s and the 80s. So we went before Judge William Hungate, and he granted our petition and said Leonard Laws needs a new penalty hearing. The guilt was clear. Okay, he was guilty. But how should he be punished? The jury needs to know the whole story before they can make a decision. And so Judge Hungate said, I agree with you, give him a penalty hearing. State of Missouri, Secretary of State's office, the Attorney General's office, a guy by the name of Stephen Hawk, who I don't know where Attorney Hawk is to this day. He's probably in some government service in Washington, D.C., probably. But he, representing the state of Missouri, opposed that, took it up to the 8th Circuit Court of Appeals, where we lost. The Judge Hungate's order was reversed, reinstate the death penalty, no new hearing for penalty. We went rehearing en banc. That's before all of the judges of the 8th Circuit, all 13 judges. We lost again. Split decisions both times, 2-1 first time, 9-4 the second time. But then it went up to the United States Supreme Court, and the court refused to take the review of the case, and so Leonard Laws was ultimately executed in Potosi at that time. It was 1993, and I was there in the room to witness with my two fellow lawyers, to witness the state of Missouri's execution of the death sentence on Leonard Laws. Did I believe that Leonard Laws deserved the death penalty? He never got an opportunity for a jury to hear his whole story and make that decision. That's the point. The jury should have had the opportunity to hear all of the aggravating and mitigating circumstances and then ultimately make the decision, whatever that decision might have been. That would have been justice. Yes, sir. David.
So one of the things is you were talking about how everything has to do with circumstance. And so, for instance, with Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and so with him, the government itself was not committing physical violence against the people. It was committing the financial and segregation on them. It was the citizens on their own accord. So there was nonviolence that was given. However, in Dietrich Bonhoeffer's case, the government itself was actively going out and killing people and all that. So I was wondering, is violence ever an acceptable answer? Because our forefathers thought so, and they were Christian men. Bonhoeffer obviously thought so to some degree.
Well, no, then that's the point that I was trying to make. He didn't justify his cooperation with the efforts to assassinate Hitler. He didn't say, I'm morally correct. He did not say, I am biblically justified at this. He said, I am violating God's command, and I am putting myself at risk of losing my eternal salvation. But I must do this. I must give my life, even my eternal life, because this is what's necessary here. So in answer to David's question is violence ever an acceptable, justified alternative, especially when the government is unjustly engaged in a systematic action of violence against an individual or a group of people, as the Nazis were against the Jews and the Gypsies and all the deformed people, the disabled people and everything. And if you didn't look perfect, you were on the list, basically. Of course, the Khmer Rouge, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia, if you wore glasses, that was it. That's all you had to do is just wear glasses. Because if you wore glasses, you were intelligent, and they wanted to bring everything back to the agrarian society in Cambodia. So, is it justified? And my answer to that is, it may be necessary, but I would never take the position that an act of violence is morally justified. That is, I have to make a decision. If I cross that line, I am doing something wrong. And am I willing to suffer all of the consequences, whatever they may be, both in this life and in the life to come, depending upon the ultimate judgment of God? But I would never take the position. Now, if you talk about revolution and the American War for Independence and things of that nature, and taking up arms against the King of England, that's another lecture, another debate, because there's many, many more facets to that. But you raise a very good question. Very good question. How much time do we have, David? 3 minutes. So, Caleb, would you defer? Will you yield the floor to JJ's brother?
Yes.
Okay. I'm sorry, because your name is? Drew. I should remember that. Caleb's middle name, no, not that Caleb, my Caleb's middle name is Andrew. So Drew. Okay, Drew.
So Bonhoeffer would agree that there is a separation between something that is right and something that is necessary.
Well, he basically said you don't talk in categories of right and wrong, good and evil. The category to inquire is, what is the will of God? Now, that seems, wait a minute, hold on. I thought God's will was what was good. I thought that was what was right and all. But Bonhoeffer, and again, I'm going to have to defer, read the book. He talks about the will of God being beyond those categories, those typical ethical categories of good and evil, right and wrong. And the necessary is the question. What is necessary in this context? Oh, Drew's question was, Bonhoeffer talked about the separation of what is justified and right and what is necessary, and are those the categories? Something along those lines, yeah. Or did you have something more on that question?
No, that's it.
Did I miss it?
No, you got it.
Did I get it? Okay, Jeremy, he says I got it.
Well, if he says you got it, you've got it.
I don't know.
So, students, you have about 30 minutes until the next lecturers, 201, 101, and in the meantime,